So today I am sharing with you this work, this contribution that me and my colleague and supervisor Michela Freddano realized, and the title is The Heuristic Value of Data for School Evaluation as a Data-Driven Decision-Making Process. First of all, I have to have a small but necessary introduction to the National School Evaluation System and remembering what are the main steps of the process. First of all, the self-evaluation, the external evaluation, the improvement agency, and the social report. But why we can say that the evaluation process is a decision-making process, and why we call it data-driven? To better explain this concept, we can take into account this model that is a data-driven decision-making model by Russell that in 1989 theorized this model that is a pyramid, that can be represented as a pyramid, at the base of which we can find data, which are then transformed into information in order to create knowledge and make wisdom-based decisions. Similarly, the school evaluation process is a data-driven process because through the self-evaluation report, a very large amount of data is shared to allow decision makers, in this specific case the school organization, to support their choices and make decisions with data-driven strategies. As said before, the self-evaluation report contains a lot of data which must be read and understood properly and correctly. So people who manage this process have to be skilled in two main fields, main aspects that are the data literacy for reading, understanding and using data, but also the digital literacy, because all the work with these documents are in digital environments like platforms, for example. And here we try to define this complex competence that comes from the integration between these two literacies, the data literacy and digital one, with a specific address to the educational environment, the educational sector. So here we have a sort of integrated definition from which derives this data and digital literacy for school evaluation. In order to identify the key aspects of this complex competence, we take into account again three main models or tools that are proposed by the European Digital Competence Framework. The DIDATTICA.org, that is the tool for educational organization, the DIDATTICA Edu for the educators, and the last one is the DIDATTICA 2.2, that is for citizens, which works in a triangulation and synergy perspective that can identify the main aspects of all the competencies, the digital competencies in these three hierarchical levels. Because of the complexity of the process we are analyzing, because of the complex nature of the school organization, we firstly identify a framework of theoretical reference that contribute to build a complex and integrated model. Because we need a theoretical model for the analysis of the project, of the evaluation process. In this sense, the model we propose here result from the combination of the 5 stages of the first model you see in the image, that is a theoretical model by Mandinak and Gummer, called Data Literacy for Educators, that is a data-driven decision-making model in school environments. The second one is a model called the Next Generation Digital Learning Environment that has 5 different dimensions. and describes the characteristics of a learning environment, digital learning environment of a new generation, so a contemporary digital learning environment. And the final one are the indicators of the 3 European models I have said before about digital competencies. From this integration, we have an iterative model, a complex model of 5 stages that are the same of the Mandinach model. So the first one, identify problems. The second one, use data, transform data into information, transform information into decision, and finally evaluate outcomes. As we can see, it's the same structure of the data-driven decision-making process. Each stage is in this sense characterized by specific competencies from the 3 levels of the European framework, as you can see from the center to the external circle, and the 5 dimensions of the learning environment or environment model. From this complex model, we observe that, that there is a sort of analogy of actions and skills with between the stages of data-driven decision-making model and those of school evaluation, school self-evaluation process. So we can overlap these 2 models and create this new model with these new stages, these new correspondent stages that are the first one, setting the process, organizing and read data, interpret data, identifying priorities and goals, and finally the social report. And we will analyze in detail each one of these stages. First of all, in this first step, it is important to understand the structure of the process itself. In this case, also the self-evaluation report tool, the structure, and what is the purpose. In particular, it's very important for this part is the effort to view the self-evaluation report not only as a mere fulfillment for schools, but as a real strategical tool for organizational learning. Secondly, it's very important to know what this document contains. So in this case, we have a key tool that is the map of indicators of the 3 years 2022-25 that details each item present in the document, divided into 4 dimensions that are the background, data about background, outcomes, processes for educational and teaching practices, and processes for management and organizational practice. The step number 2, about organization and reading of data, it is very important because this is where the understanding of the potential of data-driven decision-making takes effectively place. In fact, if you look at the available data through 2 different perspectives, a longitudinal perspective that we can that concern the individual student and his progress in the course of the school, and a chronological perspective, which mostly concern the school during the time, and it's possible to identify 3 different moments. We call the time 0 that corresponds to the before and identifies the data that describes the background. The starting situation we are analyzing. At time 1 that corresponds to the now, to the direct observation, and the time 2 that contains future data with a follow-up perspective. As can be seen, these 2 timelines about student and school goes in parallel through these 3 different steps. Corresponding to each time, we have 3 different types of data that are contained in the self-evaluation report. The background data, for example, as said before, a school population, information about territory and social capital, economical resource, and so on. About the direct observation, we have the absolute data, or the data we can observe, that are the data we can find in the second part of this self-evaluation report, that are the outcomes. And the third part is the distance data. We find the outcomes at the distance, so the observation about the results in the future. And as we can see, each of these data set comes from different sources, for example, INVALSI, Institute, Ministry, ISTAT, and so on. Among the observed data, also we can find the data referring to the processes and that describe the school situation from the perspective of teaching and management strategies at the time we are observing. The goal of the self-evaluation report is reading in an integrated way this data, specifically by reading the background data together with the observed data. So we have what we call a contextualized data, or net data, which expresses the progress in terms of learning levels, considering also the incidence of the background. Together with this contextualized data, we find two other values that can be observed during this chronological and longitudinal reading. One is referring to the school and one to the student, that are the school effect and the student dropout. School effect is the value that indicates how successful the school is in advancing its students despite contextual conditions. It represents the summary of the processes on which the school actually has the opportunity to intervene. Specifically, it is in this segment that the actual decision-making process takes place. Referring to the student dropout, we can identify two different segments. The explicit dropout, or the number of young people with no more than the first grade of secondary school or a 2-year qualification, and the implicit dropout, that is the identification of students who don't reach the minimum level in terms of basic skills and are at risk of explicit dropout. With the third step, after understanding what is the purpose of the self-evaluation report and organizing data, we need to interpret the data we find in the tables of the self-evaluation report. And we have seen that data comes from different sources, and many tables can show very different type of data that need to be compared. For example, you can see in this table we can have up to 6 different types of data in the same table. So among the major difficulties that we can identify in this stage, there is first of all the identification of the type of data, the reading and the interpreting of this data, but also the proposal, so the difficulty in developing proposal and use of data in digital environments. In order to facilitate this step, the self-evaluation report was here analyzed, identifying for each indicator and descriptor the type of data expressed. So this, the result is that we have 5 main types that recur in the different areas of the document, and they are numbers, numerical means, percentage, percentual means, and values that indicated, for example, a presence or absence of an element or service. The data are here organized in 2 ways. Some data referring to the school and some other are referring to the reference that are the data that comes from the province, macro area, region, and nation. These 5 principal types of data recur in the document, and it is possible to quantify this recursiveness. And what we can see is a majority of percentage and presence absence values in the school data, and a majority of percentage and perceptual means in the reference data. But if it's important to read the single data correctly, what makes the difference in the interpretation step is the comparison between the school data and the reference ones. That is the real transition from data to information. So we have identified also 5 main types of data comparison. So as we can see, we have some majorities that are really evident, and they are located in different areas. Having such a precise organization allows us to compose a framework more possibly accurate for the reality of the phenomena. In fact, if we can start from indicators, guiding questions, descriptors, we can identify also strengths, weaknesses, formulate a judgment, identify constraints and opportunities, for example. After the interpretation of data and the formulation of strengths and weaknesses, we are able to identify some priorities. So we have a simulation of 2 different possibilities. In the first case, if the interpretation, during the interpretation, we can identify positive issues and strengths, therefore we can, for example, go and check whether the goals of previous years have been achieved, reading social report and previous self-evaluation reports. Or in the second case, if we identify some critical aspects and issues and weaknesses, we have to think in terms of perspective, or in terms of priorities, expected outcomes, and the formulation of process objectives. Finally, the last stage describes the transition from decision to agency, that is the social report, which has the objective of accounting for the, for example, use of resources, outcome achieved, and so on, in a sort of dialogue between the school and the stakeholders. The social report is also a planning tool for the following 3-year plan of education, for example, or the improvement plan. In conclusion, we want to explain the competencies that in details are necessary in the evaluation process according to the integrated models we analyzed in the opening of this speech. For example, if we are going to read these 5 steps in columns, we can find the correspondent dimension of the digital learning environment. For example, we have personalization, interoperability, accessibility, collaboration, and assessment in general, assessment and learning. For example, if we read the first column, that was the very first step of Mandinap model, identify problems, we can find the first self-evaluation step, that is setting the process. And we can find competencies as know the structure and purpose of the process, organization of the self-evaluation process, establishing guidelines for accessible reading, and so on. The goal of this systematization is to identify training paths that are built from each individual stage of the process. In fact, each column may correspond to a single training module, composed, for example, of 5 corresponding topics. This makes it possible, moreover, to be able to design tools for the evaluation of competence. In order to go fixing the difficulties that we find in the reading and interpreting of data. To conclude, as a future research perspective, we think that there is a need in terms of an integrated system of tools, procedures and skills for the school self-evaluation, also in terms of learning, not only in terms of evaluation, as a sort of design of training paths for the competencies like data and digital literacy, for example, based on the integrated model. And finally, the implementation of digital platforms, not only as management environments, but also as learning environments. Thank you for your attention.